Hey everyone, Dr. Dan here, and it's time for number 2 in the Health in Your Hands initiative. And earlier this week, I started with talking about our beliefs and how our belief structures and the way we view health and the possibilities within life actually change the number of opportunities we have in terms of being able to attain health, or limiting our opportunities in terms of being stuck in illness and disease. And what I'm going to talk about right now is how that manifests in a neurological level, how it shows up in our brain and in our body. So first, let me call it out real quick here. I'm doing this initiative, this Health in Your Hands thing, where I'm helping to share information that I think is valuable and important in terms of attaining health on a personal level that's meaningful, that lasts, that's a long-term effort, and that we can use to share with our family, our friends, our community, and into future generations. Literally taking the health of our population into our own hands. And yet I'm not sharing with you individual things you can do in your lifestyle or in your diet or in your exercise routine to make these changes yet, because it's important to understand the underlying principles of how health happens and what gets in the way of it, and how our very mindset and understanding of what's going on in our bodies plays a humongous role in the outcomes in terms of the actions we take on a day-to-day basis. So we're going to lay out the foundation here a little bit more thick and deep before jumping into individual things we can do on a day, like exercise, diet, so on and so forth, in order to make these changes happen. So earlier this week we talked about how our beliefs alter and change and lay the groundwork for whether we have more or less possibility available to us in terms of healing or hurting. Today we're going to talk about how that shows up in a mind-brain connection on the brain, nervous system, and body level. So here's how that goes. To understand this fully, we're going to have to talk about the fight or flight versus rest and digest system. So if you've heard of fight or flight, which is the part of our body that reacts to stress and danger, you've probably heard about it in terms of the sympathetic nervous system, or the stress response in the body, versus rest and digest, which is the parasympathetic or the healing state of the body's system. And these two different systems in the nervous system, these two automatic nervous system functions, are what determine whether our body is healing or hurting. And what determines if we're in fight or flight versus rest and digest? It's the level of stress, or specifically the overwhelm to stress, or in response to stress that we're experiencing in a given environment, or a given circumstance. So in a short term, we tend to use the example of running from a tiger being the thing that our ancestors theoretically did when they were in fight or flight mode. When you have a real danger to your life, a threat to your immediate well-being in your environment, our body will go into a defense response so we can fight, run, flee, play dead, whatever we need to do to get away from that situation. So our body shuts down things like digestion, cellular repair, other organ functions, and puts all its energy towards the big muscle groups so we can run away and huff down lots of oxygen and get out of there as fast as possible, or fight. However, there are other ways that our body can enter this circumstance, and it's specifically in our culture, it shows up in all sorts of ways in the form of regular, chronic, everyday stress. Now, when there's not a pandemic happening in the world, we find ourselves in fight or flight in this sympathetic stress response on a regular basis. That's honestly the main reason people seek care at our office, is because of the chronic stress conditions that are showing up in their lives, whether it's chronic pain, chronic illness, chronic digestive issues, chronic sleep problems, chronic mood and behavior, mental issues. They manifest from the constant low-level stress that we experience in our culture. Well, right now, we're in a pandemic. So for the past 4 weeks, a lot of folks in our entire world, especially in our culture, have been living in a state of almost perpetual stress, which does crazy things to the body. It puts the body first and foremost into a perpetual fight or flight sympathetic stress response. And that does a few things to us. On a brain level, I told you the important thing about the mindset and the belief structure is that it creates new opportunities for us to get past, move through, heal from, grow from certain stresses in our life. When we're in this chronic stress response, one of the first things that happens is that the front part of the brain, what we call the frontal cortex, the most human part of us, the part that's self-aware, that is able to think rationally, analyze the environment, the part we're so proud of as humans, it goes into, it gets suppressed. It gets less blood flow and oxygen. It gets less neurological stimulation. And we lose a couple of our faculties. Specifically, we lose these things. We lose the ability to think rationally and clearly. We lose the ability to find safety in our environment. We lose the ability to process reality effectively. we lose our focus and our attention, we lose control over our behaviors, and we lose our control over our mood and our emotions. So these are things that we lose control of to a greater extent, the greater level of stress we're under. And for the longer amount of time that we're under these heavy levels of stress or chronic levels of stress. So in terms of finding opportunities in life, finding opportunities in health, finding new possibilities for moving through stressful situations and finding your way to a more whole, a more happy, and more fulfilled state of being, which is the belief that I laid down in the last video. In terms of attaining those things, we can start to see how being in a chronic stress state and suppressing the functioning part of that brain that's responsible for achieving that focused attention, control of behavior, mood, and emotion, but specifically the processing of reality, the determining of new courses of action in response to new stresses in the environment. That part of our brain becomes less accessible to us when we're under chronic stress. Another thing happens that's really interesting. The front part of the brain is responsible for something called fear extinction. Now, what is that? Fear extinction. Well, it's just what it sounds like. When fear shows up in our bodies because of a potential threat in our environment, our first response is to go into defense mode, go into stress mode, go into that fight or flight response, which suppresses that part of the brain we're talking about. However, we have a built-in mechanism to help suppress that. In the front part of the brain, we have this fear extinction. When we finally get a sense of what's going on in our reality and we can process our environment properly, which ideally we do pretty quickly, because what's the point of cowering in a corner and being afraid if all there was well, pardon me if you're afraid of spiders, but if you saw a spider and you freak out but you realize it's a tiny little spider, then ideally your brain says, oh, this is no big deal, I've seen this before, I can deal with this. If nothing else, I'll get the shoebox and smash it, or please don't do that. If you can control yourself, just throw the thing outside, get rid of, put it outside, get it out of your environment. And you can overcome the fear and extinguish the fear. The fear it becomes extinct. Fear extinction, right? However, when we're under so much stress that our brain is constantly in a state of fight or flight, stress mode, we lose even the ability to extinguish our own fear. So if you look at what's been happening in the past 4 weeks, more than 4 weeks now, we're seeing this unimaginable load that we've never before had in our environment, in our world, where we're constantly exposed to stress and fear-based stress, where we're afraid for our lives, we're afraid for our family, we're afraid for our country. You're stuck in stress mode. And so what that means is that your brain has limited access to things like rational decision-making, to the ability to find safety in the environment, the ability to process and make sense of reality. So literally, being in a stressed out state makes us less capable of finding new options and opportunities and finding new possibilities in our own health and healing. So it's counterproductive in a very direct way to be in a chronic stressed out state and have what essentially is a limited scope of reference, which is what happens when we go into a stress response. We narrow our focus so we can focus just on the thing that's going to hurt us, or theoretically going to hurt us, because in our modern environment, most of our stresses are not immediate dangers to our life, and yet our body reacts the same. So we limit our scope of possibility and we narrow our brain's interaction with the world around us. So I hope that's clear how being in a state of chronic stress literally limits our capacity to engage with and interact with life and to find new ways past the stress and to grow from the stress and to get out the other end healthier than we were before rather than sicker. But if that's not clear enough, let's talk about what that has to do with the actual immune health and the day-to-day health of your body. When our brain goes into that stress mode, it also activates the part of our brain that's more towards the middle, that we tend to call the emotional brain, that stores reactionary behaviors in response to traumatic or emotional events in our lives. So what happens when we shut down that frontal cortex, that very human part of the brain? The executive function, the faculties of the brain kind of sink back a little bit, and they go more to this reactive behavior, this fear-based response that is running programs, essentially. We all know what a program is on your computer. You install programs, and it carries this code, this information that runs a certain way every time. That's the way a program's supposed to work, where our brain is storing programs in a way that is far beyond any computer. And so we're running programs that we laid down in response to traumatic events or stressful times in our lives when we're under chronic stress, and that front part of the brain can't function. We sink back into the more emotional part of the brain, and we're running these stress patterns in response to an event that ideally requires a greater scope of reference, more processing of reality, more safety, more ingenuity, but we have less because we're under chronic stress. With that process, we also see a few more things happen. We see the nerve that runs down the brainstem, down into the body, called the vagus nerve, which is incredibly important for healing and for keeping calm and peaceful in our body. That nerve gets shut off, it gets suppressed. And the joints and the muscles of our spine, and the bones of our spine, start to lock up and they become rigid. And then we lose stimulation to the brain, which is essential for keeping ourselves conscious, healthy, and well. So in response to this stress mode, we get a suppression of the vagus nerve, which is incredibly important for breathing, immune function, I said respiration already, sleeping, digestion. We lose function in that part of our body. And our spine, which is constantly in motion to help stimulate our brain and keep us awake and aware and functioning properly, starts to lock up. So it's no surprise that coming to a chiropractor like myself, we work with the spine to help liberate the tension in the spine, liberate the tension in the nervous system, to help stimulate the brain, to help get the brain out of these stress patterns. Because when you stimulate the brain and get yourself out of these stress patterns, the body finds new possibilities for health and healing. Literally, from a body perspective outward, we see an increase in the vagal tone, or the functioning of the vagus nerve, which allows our immune system to work properly, allows our digestion to work properly, which is essential for immune function. It allows our sleep to come more easily and to be more sound, which is essential for immune function. It allows our respiration to be more deep and even, which is essential for immune function and for brain health and for cell repair and for all of the body's processes. So we're talking about, from a brain perspective downward, we get this suppression of the faculties responsible for clear, conscious thought when we're under chronic stress. We limit our own possibilities when we can't get ourselves out of the stress mode. We also limit our body's possibilities by suppressing the part of our body responsible for healing, responsible for immune function, responsible for cellular repair, so on and so forth. And the bones of the spine, along with the joints and the muscles, start to get tight, get locked up. And so we become more rigid. Our body becomes more chronically ill, in pain, uncomfortable, disconnected from brain function. And so we end up getting in this body state that is furthering the stress response in the brain. And so you can see how it becomes a cycle. It becomes a cycle that we can get stuck in as long as we are constantly being bombarded by stress. That's why I started earlier this week with the video that says the first most powerful thing we can do is sit down and think about and come up with a conclusion about the belief system we want to have about our own body. Because if we believe that our body is self-healing and self-maintaining, and that we have the power built within us, that we're designed to function properly and to heal from the inside out, then we have a boatload of opportunities within the stress response to start to find our way out of it. What are those possibilities? Well, that's what we're going to get into in the next few weeks, whether it's diet and lifestyle, exercise, meditation, mindset. All these things we're going to talk about in great detail as time goes on. But when we believe that our body has the capability from within to create these changes sustainably in a way that's meaningful, that actually makes us healthier, makes us more resilient, makes us happier, more conscious, that we can pass that on to our friends and relatives, that we can pass it on to future generations, those are possibilities that we want to bank on, where we have access at the tips of our fingers to make these changes in our lives, versus that other idea that our body is a machine that just breaks down, and once it breaks down, it must be fixed from an external authority. Well, when we're in this chronic stress state and things are going haywire and we can't get a grip on our own physiology, our own brain function, where are you going to turn? There is no mechanic to go to say, turn the knob for me, get me out of this stress state. Now you can get support. Like I said, what we see at our office here is that we adjust the spine, and we see people talk about improved sleep, more energy, more clarity, more focus, better digestion, quicker recovery from illness and injury, right? So these things start to happen spontaneously, not because I'm pushing the health button or I'm cranking the sleep knob, but because by properly stimulating the brain, by properly caring for the body, by supporting the body's natural capacity to function and heal well, the body starts to go through its own healing process. We liberate the joints and the bones of the spine. We stimulate the part of the brain responsible for conscious thought and finding safety and rationality in the world. And then we start to reawaken the part of the body, such as the vagus nerve, responsible for the immune function, for digestion, for respiration, right? So we stimulate these things that are so important for constant ongoing health on a day-to-day basis. And by doing so, we create a body, we help build and cultivate a body that is a body that can carry us through the long haul in life, that can get us through stress now and in the long term. That's what we want. We're afraid of the future because we don't know what it's going to bring. If we're afraid of the future, why not care for the one thing that can assure that we're going to get there with the greatest possible outcome? Care for the body, care for the mind in a way where we're becoming resilient and adaptable and strong, and that we're becoming familiar and more intimately connected with our body's own processes, right? This is that thought that we are built to function well, that our bodies are built to be healthy, that we're naturally healing and maintaining, versus that we're just these machines that break down eventually and we're meant to be sick and that you have to ask someone from the outside to cut you and stitch things back together. It doesn't give you the options to actually invest in your body's own response to maximize and optimize this brain's capacity to see through stress, to get ourselves out of a stress state where we can see clearly, control our emotions, control our behavior, make decisions based on rationality, which we love to talk about rationality in our Western culture. And yet, do we even have access to it? Because we're stressed out so much of the time. Where we can intimately and consciously stimulate our own immune system and our own respiratory system and our own cardiovascular system in a way that is intentionally moving us toward a healthier, more robust way of being, a way of living, where we're investing in the insurance of our own body. That's the kind of health that I'm talking about when I say health is in your hands, rather than the kind where, well, gosh, if we're spinning out of control, we're going down the drain because we're so stressed out that nothing's working, our body's not working, we feel at a loss, we feel sick, we feel overwhelmed, we feel exhausted, we feel stressed, and we can't get ourselves out of it. In order to wait for somebody else to fix us, it means that we are waiting for ourselves to break versus caring for the frame, caring for the body and the mind as in real time, as we are encountering the stresses of life. And again, this kind of stress that I'm talking about, this is why people come to see us, so that they can help cultivate the body that can naturally start to overcome these stresses more efficiently. Well, that's at a time when we are not in a pandemic, where the global climate was not one of crisis and fear. We're facing a time when the amount of effort and energy we've invested into becoming naturally resilient and naturally confident in trusting our own body's ability to heal is showing ourselves as being horribly insufficient. Because right now we're at a point where we're at a loss. So many folks don't know what to do, don't know how to handle this, and don't know how to prepare for the future. And yet, health is still in our hands. It has always been within. It will remain within. And if we do the proper things, if we take the proper actions, we can help wake up the brain, wake up the body, and cultivate that resilience from within. So what we're going to do over the next few weeks, we're going to talk about specific things we can do. And I'm going to be tying them back in over and over and over again to these underlying principles, these underlying concepts that we're talking about, like mindset, like how the stress of our environment right now is actually causing trauma in people's bodies and what we can do about that trauma and how we should relate to it. So we'll get into that piece by piece, and I encourage you just to swallow what you can, one piece at a time. Apply it in your lives. Don't worry about making sweeping lifestyle changes, because there are small things that you can do with proper intention and a good reason behind it, understanding why you're doing something, that can have sweeping impacts on the rest of your life and into your social circle, into our human circle. And hopefully we can start to achieve some of the things that I have in mind for us as humanity, which is to improve our global cultural sense of well-being and what it means to be healthy, rather than relying on an external authority once we've already broken down to try to stitch us back together. So stick with it. Let me know what you think about this today, and we'll look forward to next week's videos. So long.